or visit us online at oltmanpatent.com. That's OLTMANPATENT.com. Spokesperson, not an attorney. The opinions expressed on the preceding sponsored program were strictly those of its hosts, guests, and callers, and not necessarily those of this station, its staff, management, or sponsors. The content of the following program, including all statements from the host and guests, is to provide general information and commentary about the law. Under no circumstances does any statement made by a host or guest to a caller or listener constitute legal advice or the formation of an attorney-client relationship, and the material from this program should not be viewed as a substitute for personal consultation with an attorney. Welcome to Talk Legal with Jeff Van Tresse, who brings you all the latest news in the legal world. Jeff will be discussing a variety of legal topics with experts in the field. If you would like to ask a question or share a story on the air, please call toll-free 888-565-1470. Once again, that's 888-565-1470. Now, let's talk legal with Jeff Van Tresse.
Another edition of Talk Legal. Your host, Jeff Van Tresse. I'm an attorney with the law firm Oltman, Flynn & Kubler, where we practice intellectual property law, including patents, trademarks, and copyrights. You can view all episodes of this show on our website at oltmanpatent.com. That's OLTMANPATENT.com. You can also find out more about our firm on our website. This evening, my guest is Bill Crispin. We are recording remotely from Gainesville, Florida, in Bill's office. For those of you watching on the podcast, you can see his sign in the back with his name on it. Bill is an agricultural attorney, and we're going to talk a little bit about a number of topics tonight related to agricultural law, including GMO labelings and a few other issues. So, Bill, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Oh, thanks so much, Jeff. It's an exciting topic in this day and age, and I hope the listening audience enjoys it.
So tell us a little bit about agricultural law. What is a typical case that you deal with?
Well, of course, agricultural law can encompass a wide variety of areas that are conducive to the production, regulation, and consumption of food. So, generally speaking, when people hear about the topic initially, they think about terms of estate planning lawyers, tax lawyers, lawyers who will work with industry on lobbying issues and so forth. My area of practice within the agricultural realm is exclusive to producers, those who produce the food from the ground. And as such, I get involved with issues if they have a problem with the seed. There's a whole body of what's called seed law in the country, particularly here in Florida. I get involved with, do a lot of work with federal crop insurance claims. Most farmers these days must have some type of federal crop insurance coverage in order to be eligible for any other disaster type relief. And so that's a main part of my practice. Neighbor disputes, whether it involves fence boundary issues or what one would call spray drift, where one grower might spray a certain herbicide on his crop or weeds, and it drifts over and impacts a crop to the neighbor. Those are called spray drift cases. All those and others are germane to what my focus is. A lot of people, there's a big segment of agricultural law that has a area called food law, and that's what you typically see mostly in the newspapers these days. Food law would encompass issues of the GMOs, genetically modified organism crops, food labeling laws, and those type of things that are germane to the American consumer. And so we can dive into several of those topics, Jeff, as this program evolves.
So GMOs, you mentioned, the genetically modified organisms. These are crops whose DNA has been altered to make them more resistant to pests and more resistant to pesticides, specifically herbicide spraying with Roundup, which is a herbicide that's used to control weeds, but without actually killing the crop. There's Roundup Ready corn, there's Roundup Ready alfalfa, as it's called, genetically modified organisms have been planted for years, but the property, that's the seeds, are actually owned by Monsanto, and so somebody can't just go and plant these GMOs on their own without paying something to Monsanto. Isn't that correct?
Well, that's right. And Monsanto isn't the only company that manufactures GMO products, but they've been certainly in the news. They were one of the early research leaders on the topic. There's a couple aspects on that. Now, Monsanto invested a tremendous amount of money and resources in the development of the seed and buying up smaller companies to control a market share. And they protect that market share with ferocity and a lot of money. And so anytime there's a dispute of whether it's a neighbor getting GMO pollen on their non-GMO crop, or someone using last year's seed for this year without paying Monsanto, Monsanto is there with their troops, and they're a fierce combatant in that regard. But there's also some other interesting things about that. I just recently had a case in Illinois where my client had 120 acres of non-GMO corn, and the spray service came in and sprayed Roundup. It's glyphosate Roundup, thinking it was Roundup-ready corn or Roundup-resistant corn. And of course, that Roundup killed all 120 acres, dead as a doornail, and it raised an interesting question of how can the sprayer services recognize, they got to be very careful these days, because a non-GMO corn, stalk of corn looks the same as a GMO stalk of corn. But on a lot of the ramifications, it seems like there's two tangents on the GMO issue that consumers are impacted by. One is the health of the food itself produced through that means. Much science supports that it's a healthy thing, but it seems to me that the research that's real germane to many of the potential health impacts is unfinished, and a lot of these products were rushed on the market, and there's little basis to, we're still finding out what health impacts there are, and that's why there's such a debate about, if you go to the grocery store, you'll see GMO versus non-GMO labeling. The other thing is, talk about Roundup-ready seed. What that means is that Roundup kills weeds. So if you have soybeans or corn or some other crop that's considered Roundup ready because the seed is immune to the killing aspect of the Roundup, they can come in and spray readily all this herbicide on a cornfield, for instance, and the corn remains healthy and unfazed, but all the other types of plant material, i.e. weeds, are killed. Now, quickly addressing that aspect, a lot of the criticism of GMO substances are being criticized because of the rampant use of this type of herbicide. You'll see glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, being in the newspaper quite a bit from this point forward. It's because Roundup is used so much. You buy it at Home Depot, it's used by residences, it's used by farmers. It's used so much that it has actually had an impact on habitat, for instance, the monarch butterfly. We have a serious diminishment of monarch butterflies because they tied it to the rampant use of Roundup, not only on fields but on residential lawns. The same thing with, they're making a connection with honeybees. There's been discussions about loss of honeybee colonies, and they're tying it to the stepped-up use of Roundup because, since they can spray it all over a cornfield or a bean field, and the corn and beans, if they're GMO resistant or Roundup resistant, survive, but all the other weeds die. So a farmer or a residential unit, I think most farmers are very, chemicals are very expensive. Farmers tend to be very good stewards of application of these substances. But the rampant use across the board, made possible by GMO resistant seed, Roundup resistant seeds, has caused a much greater use of the herbicide than what we have seen in the past.
And the thing with, glyphosate is considered to be relatively safe, but the term is relative. because it has a relatively high lethal dose. In other words, you'd have to consume a great deal of it in order for it to be lethal. It's been considered safe for use on crops for years, but because, like you said, the amount has skyrocketed with the use of GMOs, now we're seeing it at such high levels that it could potentially have effects both on the environment and on people. There's been some suggestion that it could be an endocrine disruptor, among other things, and it could also have an effect on wildlife, like you were describing earlier. So now you have GMO labeling issues that come into play, as well as environmental protection issues as well.
That's exactly right. What really needs to be happening is more and more research devoted to the impacts, mid and long-term impacts of the application of these things. But we're in a time where research funding, particularly government funding, which is more objective-based than if Monsanto, for instance, not to beat up on Monsanto, but they are the big elephant in the room. If Monsanto funds research on their product, there's an inherent tendency to be a little biased. But if the research funding through government universities, like the tremendous land-grant university here at the University of Florida, that type of research is really important for the integrity of the use and temperament of these chemicals used in our food production.
So, I have to get to some of the lawsuits, particularly the Vermont lawsuit, which is ongoing right now. There's a labeling statute in Vermont that Monsanto is challenging, which requires GMO produce to be labeled as such for the consumer. The argument that's being made now is really kind of hard to believe. They're saying that because of the grower, because the Monsanto or is a corporate person, they are not required to label their products because they have a First Amendment right against compelled speech. Just to explain the background of this, First Amendment, which gives us the right to speak freely, also gives us the right not to speak under some circumstances. This goes back to a Jehovah's Witness case in which the Pledge of Allegiance was challenged, that children or their parents that didn't want their children to say the Pledge of Allegiance at school could not be forced to speak those words against their will. It's really hard to imagine, but the analogy that's being drawn here with food labeling is that after Citizens United and after the court rulings that have established corporations as people, now if corporations are considered to be people, they cannot be forced to speak against their will. And by labeling food as genetically modified, they are being forced to speak against their will, and that they have a constitutional right under the First Amendment not to disclose whether their produce is genetically modified. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, my first thought is that consumers have to be very careful of. We are all, as members of the public, losing more and more control over things that should be extremely important to us and future generations. And the cases out there concerning food labeling and let's talk about food labeling for a second. Food labeling, from a Florida agriculture perspective, is a great thing because Fresh from Florida, you've all seen that logo out there. That's the marketing aspect developed through the Florida Department of Agriculture. And it's because Florida has strict regulations on many aspects of how the crops are grown, whether it's citrus or beef or the many variety of diversified crops of watermelons and so forth. And these things are competing on the world market. And so Fresh from Florida, labeling something from Florida, should give a consumer an extra incentive or motive to pay maybe a few pennies more for that product as opposed to watermelon from China and of all places. You would think that every person who goes to the grocery store would want to know where their food is coming from and being produced.
And also because one of the greatest costs of producing food is shipment.
Absolutely. And to lose sight of that fact and getting it thrown into courtroom battle of legal arguments to where they bend the theory to the point where it categorizes as a free speech basis is really a stretch. And the only loser in the game is our listening audience, those who go to the grocery store and purchase things. That's why I love farmers markets, because the real farmers market is you're buying from the producer who produced that food stuff. The takeaway point on the food labeling is that consumers have the ultimate vote with their dollars. So if you walk into the grocery store and insist on knowing where that food comes from and voting with your dollars, that ultimately will change the pace. I remember years ago with this debate when the North America Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, was first being debated and then ultimately passed. That really kicked Florida in the behind as far as Florida's vegetable producers, because all of a sudden they were competing against Mexico and Chile and other places where they didn't before on a massive scale. And so Florida growers said, look, we know our environmental standards, we know our labor standards, we know what the end product is safe from many of the diseases you read about, and people should know that where that food has come from, so they can choose between squash from Florida City and Homestead or squash from Guatemala or Mexico. Make your choice.
And this ties into issues outside of agriculture about where your products, where your food's coming from. We have, of course, the Chinese drywall issues that come up over the last decade. Also, from China, there was a big scandal with formaldehyde that was contained in floorboards that to this day have not been totally remediated. There's a lot of houses in the United States that have toxic floorboards with people are breathing in formaldehyde, and it just turned out that in some of these instances the quality control and the regulations just were not being followed, and this is something that the country of origin or the place of origin is something that the consumers really have a right to know.
They shouldn't. We all should insist on it. And for there to be such a debate that goes away from the central focus as to what's best for the consumer and turns it into what's best for a corporation or a conglomerate who has nothing more concerned than their bottom line, I think is a real injustice to citizens. We have used to be the domestic food production used to be declared a national priority of national defense priority, and it should continue to be so. Any country who can't produce enough food to feed their own people are in trouble, and the consumer has a tremendous say in that ongoing balance.
So, what is certified organic? Because we see it all the time. We assume that it's healthier, but what is required in order for produce to be considered organic?
Well, first of all, there are a number of organizations that will certify a product as being organic. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has an arm that will certify. There's outfits in Oregon. They're called Oregon TILT, TILTH. Many different states have their own protocol for that. Generally speaking, a certified organic product means that it's been grown on property that's been absent of any man-made or inorganic fertilizers, any petroleum-based fertilizers. It's had to have a certain crop rotation so that the end result is what's being grown, let's say green beans, are being grown in from a soil that produces a bean that's free of any inorganic substances. And basically, inorganic is
not carbon-based.
Not carbon-based, that's correct. So the certifications do run the gamut, and I would ask the consumers, the listening audience, the next time they pick up a package, I would read the certification label, and then there'll probably be a website or some reference to it, and you can find out what level of certification you're receiving from the product. They're not all created the same.
So it becomes difficult for the consumer to really know what it is that they're buying. I mean, most people assume that if they go to a high-end health food store, if they go to Whole Foods, that everything that they're getting is going to be safer and either organic or free from herbicides, pesticides. Is this the case generally?
Not at all. Probably the closest thing you can get to a pure food is probably something, again, at the local farmers market. Here in Gainesville, we're really fortunate to have some tremendous farm-to-table growers. But certainly a close reading of the ingredients on the label will tell you as much about the product as any certification.
So, I'd like to turn our attention to federal crop insurance, because you deal a lot with that, and if you could explain how that works.
Well, federal crop insurance is something that came about after the Dust Bowl years, around the Depression in the United States. It used to be you could obtain crop insurance through private insurers, but the inherent risk of agriculture were deemed to be so great, private insurance industry dropped out of that picture. And so there was no insurance safety net for producers. And so therefore, in the post-Depression, the U.S. government came out and underwrote formed what's called the Federal Crop Insurance Corporation. And they actually operated it as an insurance company and underwrote the program. In 1980, and that was for the major crops of corn, wheat, soybeans, and cotton. In 1980, trying to get away from ad hoc disaster relief and expanding the safety net, the U.S. government allowed private insurance companies to come in and sell and administer the insurance, and then greatly expanded the crops that it covered. And 90+% of anything that we all eat has been grown under some form of crop insurance coverage. And sold and administered by about 18 private companies across the country, reinsured by the U.S. government, and this is strictly a controlled process. My practice, and I've been doing this on crop insurance since the early 1990s, is just like your homeowner's insurance, sometimes the insurance carrier doesn't remit an indemnity to the extent that you think you're entitled to, or they deny coverage altogether.
Indemnity is the reimbursement that you get when you suffer a loss.
That's correct, and for the insurance coverage of the policy. And so that's when I often get a phone call from the producer saying, "Listen, I've been turned down, or I didn't get enough," and it's no different than if your house gets blown off by a hurricane or some other disaster, and they say, "Well, we'll give you half of what you think you're owed."
Yeah, I think this relates back. I had Congresswoman Elaine Schwartz on my show a few weeks ago, about a month or so ago, and she was speaking very much against moving Medicaid patients onto managed care programs. In other words, it would be taking federal dollars and moving them into private insurance companies to administer these insurance plans. And she said that they're immediately going to start cutting costs, they're going to start denying benefits and so forth. And what you've experienced on this side with the moving of federal crop insurance into the private sector, that might be a bit of a forecast of what may happen in the healthcare field in the upcoming years. So do you think there might be a relationship there?
That's a good question. Certain private insurance companies have a different overhead and profit margin objective than what the government does. The government chose, with the Federal Crop Insurance Program specifically, I think overall it's worked extremely well. The challenge with the companies is getting enough competent people to adjust the crop, knowing what the crop is and doing a proper insurance adjustment, recognizing what's damaged and what isn't, what's covered by the policy and what isn't. The policies themselves are federal regulations and somewhat confounding to read and understand. And so I can give the private insurance company a break at times, but there's an ongoing relationship battle between the reinsurer, the U.S. government, and the way they administer the policy. But the takeaway, I think, for the audience here is that if we didn't have a true safety net of production in this country called federal crop insurance, all of our food products would be much more expensive and less available because more farmers wouldn't take the risk to produce it in the first place. And if they did take the risk and they had a disaster crop and had no safety net to put a crop in the field the next year, that farmer would be out of business. And so instead of growing corn, they'd be growing houses. And so it's, from the consumer and the listening audience, the crop insurance is one of the great programs that so far it hasn't fallen on itself as becoming too big. The private-public partnership in that regard, I think, has worked because it's allowed the government. Well, I have a website called afarmersfriend.com. Learn more about my practice through farmers.com.
Thank you for listening to Talk Legal with Jeff Van Tresse. Tune in next week for more insightful and exciting information about the law. You can contact Jeff by email at jvt2law@gmail.com or give him a call at 561-789-6866. That's 561-789-6866. The content of the preceding program, including all statements from the host and guests, is to provide general information and commentary about the law. Under no circumstances does any statement made by a host or guest to a caller or listener constitute legal advice or the formation of an attorney-client relationship, and the material of this program should not be viewed as a substitute for personal consultation with an attorney. The opinions expressed on the preceding sponsored program were strictly those of